There's two ways how to get out of a recession or a debt crisis, and one way is either through inflation, the other way is through high growth. Ideally, you follow the growth route to be able to shorten the time span of these projects. And it's important to have a vision, as His Highness has put forward, and a roadmap going forward, and focus for growth, not just focus on the past, but focus on the future. And we've been really blessed. I mean, for growth to happen, you need stability and security as pillars of growth. And you could see other markets that were stronger than the UAE's market have faltered substantially because of the two underpinnings of economics fundamentals have disappeared, which is stability and security.
Do you feel we've now seen that stability and security return to the UAE? Obviously, the region still has some way to go, but in the UAE, it really has become that safe haven we keep hearing about.
I believe that it has reproven itself as a safe haven for the region. And you see money flows flowing, money flows that where the UAE in the past have invested in North Africa, heavily invested in the Middle East, invested in Asia. Those people have built up a fond relationship with Dubai, and you've seen the benefit rebound in the real estate sector, and you've seen some of the FDIs get redirected to the UAE and Saudi.
We have seen a lot of that foreign investment. I think you're absolutely right. It's been interesting, actually. There has been some debate about extending the foreign ownership rules in the UAE to outside free zones. Now, the FNC decided to turn this down last week, but do you think this is something that we need to revisit in the not too distant future?
100%. I believe that is important. If we want to compete on the global stage, I mean, leave the unlisted companies. At least the listed companies should be allowed to have a free float. Without a minimum. There's different mechanisms. Different companies have golden shares, they have voting shares and non-voting shares, and that is fine by investors as long as there's no barriers. But one of the biggest catalysts that we see for, two biggest catalysts that we see for the local economy is if we join the MSCI and we move from a frontier market to an emerging market, and the other driver is if these foreign ownership rules genuinely move. This is what we've been hearing from our investors. The spirit of the 5149 law was to allow the local population not to be left behind by the more educated, sophisticated international investor, and I think it has done its job. But the whole concept of sponsoring companies was not the intention of that law. That if you have a lower percentage, say a 70-30, and you, for example, instead of being just a sponsor, you actually say, okay, well, 30% of the profit will go to pay up for the 30% of the shares to make him an actual shareholder in the business and involve and bring more intellectual property in different sectors and expertise to the local population, and that would solve a lot of issues, in my opinion, that is facing the FNC today.
You mentioned earlier a little bit about the stock markets as well. Obviously, there are some opportunities there, but they certainly have seen low trading volumes over the past few years, and we've heard repeated rumours, repeated calls for a potential merger. Do you think that combining the two bourses here in the UAE is the solution?
I think it's part of the solution. I think if the bourses do merge together, it will increase liquidity and volumes for a single exchange, and that will be hugely beneficial. But it is not the entire solution. It is part of the solution. If you add that, you add the MSCI, you add us joining the MSCI, you add a new companies law for foreign ownership for at least publicly listed companies, you could truly see a massive game changer.
Mm-hmm. It should be very interesting then. You mentioned as well that with these foreign ownership laws as well, one of the key things has been making sure that the national population do not be left behind. Now, the recent proposal would have made sure that these companies had at least 100 new jobs for Emiratis as well, and Emiratization does continue to be a priority. We've seen reports recently that public and private holidays may be aligned to try and encourage more nationals into the private sector. What do you think is key to boosting Emiratization in the private sector?
I think it is, number one, more apprenticeship programs, more willingness to actually stick out for longer. Usually companies need at least a 3-year track record of expertise in that field and have patience to be able to grow. In any career in banking or other sectors, there's a curve. After you gain, say, 5 to 10 years, that's when you get the growth. But having such a low Emirati population is also a challenge in finding and recruiting people, I don't see that we have a significant unemployment issue, because if, you know, the moment we find a highly qualified Emirati in the finance sector, we try to hold on to them and try to recruit them. I think you have a lot of elective unemployment. You have unemployment of someone who, you know, who doesn't have certain qualifications. But today an Emirati should be able to find a job immediately, given if they have certain requirements for that job. It's certain qualifications, certain abilities, certain requirements, certain degrees, certain amount of work experience.
So what do you think the key is to changing this then? Is it about adjusting salaries? Is it the holidays that we mentioned before? Obviously you've said there are a lot of qualified people out there. Is it additional qualifications? Is it finding the right people?
Well, actually we compete with government employers on salaries, pay, packages, if we want to hire Emiratis. And that is a challenge for a privately listed, for private companies. So, you know, but there are different sectors that don't require such a high pay that you can hire Emiratis. And I think it's change of mindset. It is something that will be addressed over time, and we could see high growth in it. It's a change of mindset of the employer and the employee. But, you know, it's very hard for the private sector to compete with government jobs that have less time and more pay.
So do you think we need to increase incentives in the private sector or lower the incentives in the public sector?
Well, I think it's increasing the incentives in the private sector, but it has to be subsidized in some way. Private companies that do hire Emiratis should be rewarded for that and subsidized in some way or form.
Well, hopefully we do see that happen. Finally, what's the best piece of investment advice you've ever been given? Investment advice, business advice, and what kind of words of wisdom do you have for potential up-and-coming leaders of tomorrow?
You know, I think one of my favorite is God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, so listen twice as much as you talk. So that's one of my favorites. But there's many wise people out there with many good investment tips. But, you know, at the end of the day, an investor should always listen to what he or she thinks, not what just other people say. Because if my rule is if the taxi driver is talking about it, that's the time to sell it. Opportunities are not apparent, and they're not in everyone's face. And by the time the public hears about it in a very loud way, it's usually too late. So I try to look for opportunities and invest in things that I understand, I know, and I believe in.